today's program is the Japanese Garden in Jackson Park, then and now. And we're very pleased to have Trish Morris as our speaker. She created the handout and training used by the Japanese Garden docents, as well as the web page for the garden. She's also the author of Hyde Park Stories in the Hyde Park Herald, and I understand she has an article coming out soon, and on the Hyde Park Historical Society website. Trish has a PhD from UChicago, and after teaching American Studies and Literature at Union College, St. Lawrence University, and Michigan State University, she returned to Hyde Park, where she has served on the Executive Council of the Hyde Park Kenwood Community Conference, the Hyde Park Garden Fair, and the Hyde Park Used Book Sale, which just ended 4 days this past weekend, and I understand was quite successful. She, an avid local historian, known to many of us as Hyde Park Trish. We have more of her at her website, which is patricia-moore.com if you want to look up more. But we're so glad that she's here with us. She's going to be giving us a presentation and with PowerPoint, and reserve your questions at the end, and you can raise your hand or you can put your questions in the chat box, and myself and Trish will get to your question, and she will have a conversation with you about that. Eventually, the presentation will be uploaded on the Hyde Park Village YouTube, as well as the slides. So we're very glad that you're here. Welcome, Trish.
Well, thank you. So let's see if we can get this to work here. That looks good. So this is, so I was invited at one point to try to give in-person tours, but that proved too complicated. So this talk evolved out of that idea of giving a walking tour. But also I wanted to, in some ways I like this better because I can give some of the background of the Japanese garden, why we have one, why the Japanese themselves care so much about it, and some of the events that are happening. It's easier to do with PowerPoint. So, you know, I'm glad to have this opportunity to share something I love. So here we go. Oops, I have to find that, there we go. So the first thing I want to do is acknowledge Bob Carr, because this isn't my original research. He has devoted unbelievable amounts of time to digging through the archives to really come up with the story of the past of the garden. And of course, he's the founder of the gardenofthephoenix.org, and you know, is working to bring resources to the garden. So I want to do the shout out to Bob Carr. So his vision of the garden is that it encapsulates the history of Japan and an American relationship. And that relationship started in 1853 when, I'm going to see if I can shrink the gallery. There we go. And I don't have to, I have more on my screen to look at. So the Admiral Perry, our Admiral Perry, sails to Japan with 4 warships, sails into the harbor and insists that Japan open its shores. They, of course, are an island nation, and they had managed for 220 years to keep the outside world out of Japan, even though the colonial powers of Europe were circling around, and they had remained an agricultural society. But Admiral Perry said he wasn't leaving until they agreed to have diplomatic relations, trade relations, and provide the ability for the steamships to fuel up. And the Japanese agreed, but they also realized that in order to stay an independent nation, they had to modernize. So the shogunate that had ruled for 220 years collapses, and they get the emperor back, and they modernize, they industrialize their society. So fast forward a generation, an envoy from the president of the United States shows up and invites them to come to Chicago. The whole international community, of course, is being invited. And the Japanese realize this is a great opportunity to show off what they've achieved in this generation. And they decide that they're going to go all in. There's an imperial commission, and they're going to spend a whopping sum of money to show off everything they've gotten done. So at the fair, this is a map of the fair, somewhat overlaid over the current look of Jackson Park. So there were these 13 themed buildings, what is known as the White City, and they were these huge buildings, and they were themed, so it was agriculture and mining and electricity. The foreign nations, the companies, and the states all were competing to try to get into these buildings, and that was the main way to show off and advertise what they had. The problem was the competition was fierce. Japan was the only, Japan and Germany were the only countries that got into all 13 buildings because of the strength of their willingness to spend on the exhibits. So this is the little arcs show all of their places where you would see large Japanese exhibition of their technical might and art, women's exhibit. They also had a bazaar out on the Midway. In the Jackson Park, you couldn't sell, you could only sell things out on the Midway. So they had a bazaar out there. They had a tea house. And this area was the area that was reserved for countries' pavilions. Most of the pavilions are actually more like offices. Whole contingents were coming to the fair for the whole summer. So these buildings were quite often, some of them had residences, they had offices, and they had a small exhibit area. But Japan didn't want to do that. They wanted a chance to show off Japanese culture. A lot of what was going on at the fair was this march of Western progress, and they wanted to show that their history was as valuable and as important and educate the West. So they were going all in. This is the bazaar on the Midway. It was 2 stories. It was free to get in. The second story had exhibits. So it had like this one, mannequins dressed in samurai outfits. On the ground floor, though, you could buy really expensive silks, cloisonné, and lacquerware. The Midway is really honky-tonk. So everybody comments on the Japanese bazaar that they had sticker shock. They got in there and they said, whoa, this stuff's really expensive. So they wanted to make sure the world knew what quality was coming out of Japan. They had the tea garden where you could afford a cup of tea. That was over by the other countries. So this is Brazil, and this is Ceylon. And you can see it's a nice layout with a pier where the gondolas could arrive and you could come have your cup of tea. And it's across the bridge from where the main pavilion was on Wooded Island. The fair is designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. The whole layout, the way the lagoons would work. And he, of course, has this philosophy of how people interact with their environment. He said that the fair was going to be overwhelming, and it was. Everybody comments on how amazing it was. Thousands and thousands of exhibits, these huge buildings and massive crowds as the summer went on. He wanted this spot that was relaxing and quiet, right in the middle. So when they're re-sculpting the whole land, they leave a sandbar that's there on the edge of the lake that has some bur oaks on it. So Wooded Island is actually original land. It's the original lake coast of the lake. He leaves the bur oaks, he plants a whole bunch of other trees, and they plant the whole edge with aquatic plants that they stole from the Calumet River. And he was insisting, Olmsted was insisting that there be absolutely no buildings. This is a place for relaxation. But everybody wants to get on the island because it's right in the middle of the lagoon. It's central real estate. Finally, Burnham kind of twists his arm because the Japanese are spending so much money at the fair. And the Japanese point out that this will actually fit his vision of Wooded Island. It'll be low, it's horizontal, it's natural materials, it's restful. And so Olmsted agrees. The other thing about it is this was permanent land, and this was a permanent gift to the city of Chicago. So that's how they got the prime real estate of Wooded Island. Their decision what to make of this pavilion was to do a tribute to Chicago's rise from the ashes. So it's the Phoenix Pavilion, the Ho'oden, and of course that's the Western idea of the Phoenix. But it's also a tribute to the Eastern idea of the Phoenix, which the Phoenix, actually a pair of phoenixes, come from heaven at the start and launch a new era of peace and prosperity. And that's what their vision of the Columbian Exposition was, that they're showing what they had would create this new era. Also, it was a tribute to their history because a foundational building in Japan is the Temple of the Phoenix. It was built in the 11th century, and you can see it has the central part, and it has the two wings of the Phoenix, and this has the central part in the two wings. They wanted to demonstrate traditional architecture, so it's built without nails. Hundreds of people, craftsmen, had built it in Japan and then disassembled it, put it in boxes, and they sent it with 24 master craftsmen to Chicago. It was a long journey, and they arrived in January. So these poor guys are trying to build the pavilion in January. And it absolutely fascinated people. So many people were hanging around watching the fair get built that they started charging admission, about the equivalent of $7 for us, to just hang around and watch people work. And some of the people watching them work were Frank Lloyd Wright and the Prairie School architects. And the style of the Ho'oden transformed American domestic architecture, which would be a second talk, so I'm not going to go too far into that, but it was an important building for the Japanese and an important building for us. So it's got three parts, and they want to educate the West on the sweep of Japanese history. So the North Wing was the medieval, basically the era when the temple was built. The South Wing was when Buddhism arrives, and it was Zen. And they would have tea ceremonies in the South Wing, the Ashikaga period. And the center was the Tokugawa, the shogunate period, which was elaborate decoration, really high-end artistry, and every surface was decorated to the extent that they published this beautiful brochure on what was in the exposition, which was a copy of which is in the Art Institute. It's a permanent gift. Wooded Island was a permanent structure. So when in 1894, Olmsted and Sons are redoing all of Jackson Park and the Midway, they basically ignore Wooded Island. So it's kind of dormant on the island. I mean, it's taken care of, but that's it. A man named George Shimoda had designed at this point a stroll garden, but it wasn't done. They didn't have the money. So everything just basically sits there until the mid-1930s. There's a revival of this north end of the park. The Field Museum had moved out of the old Palace of Fine Arts in the 1920s, and Rosenwald's redoing it in limestone to turn it into the Museum of Science and Industry. So that's really energizing things. The WPA is doing a lot of stonework on a lot of the gardens. And there's the Century of Progress World's Fair. So Japan has another pavilion and another tea house. And we also now finally have a Council General of Japan here in Chicago. And so they donate at the end of the Century of Progress, the tea house, the gate, and some lanterns. they rehab the Ho'oden, and they finally create this stroll garden that Shimoda had designed in 1894. And the Consul General said at the dedication something that I think sums up why the Japanese keep coming back and financing the resurrection of the garden. He said, "We revere this ground as a bit of our homeland transplanted in the heart of a great and friendly nation." So it was quite a complex in the 30s. It was landscaped all the way from side to side. It had 2 ponds that were not connected to the outer lagoon. The tea house is where the pavilion was, and the Ho'oden is, of course, still there. And it's where the sky landing is now, if you're trying to get your bearings. This is a postcard. It was popular enough to have postcards. This was the tea house down by the water. And it was protected, which unfortunately the garden's never been in ever since. It had a fence, and it had the gate from the Century of Progress, and it had a caretaker. Shoji Osaka, this guy, is a photographer and an artist. He married a Kansas woman. They had 3 kids, and he's making sure the tea garden runs, that the Park District workers are keeping care of the stroll garden, and that the Ho'oden is open to the public. So this was the heyday for the Japanese garden in Jackson Park. And here's the tea garden. They hired local Japanese Americans to, again, present Japanese culture. You could have your tea up by the Ho'oden or down by the water. It was very popular. It shows up in the Herald, of people meeting in the garden. And if you go to the garden, there's a couple of survivors you can see from this period. The large stone steps that lead up to the pavilion are the large stone steps that led to the tea house. The Kasuga lantern, the very big one that's on the outside, dates from the fair, and the lily pads. Apparently they are resilient and managed to survive. So Shoji Sato, this period lasts 6 years. The Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. There's hysteria on the West Coast, fueled by the Hearst newspapers, and they intern everyone of Japanese descent in internment camps on the West Coast, in the Western exclusion zone. The rest of the country, and that's without any due process. The rest of the country, there's actually some due process, and they look at who's out. And so they don't intern all the Japanese nationals. And of course, if you're a Japanese immigrant, you are a citizen of Japan, because it was illegal to become a citizen of the United States. Only 2nd generation people born here could be citizens. So Shoji is not a citizen, and he has spent the last 6 years promoting Japanese culture. So he's seen as a dangerous alien and is interned. But just to show the schizophrenia of racism, Sono Osato, his daughter, who's become a prima ballerina of the Ballet Russe, she and her mother moved to New York. And during the war, she's actually starring on Broadway and in lots of ballets. So Shoji did not survive very long after the camps. His health was shattered by the experience, and neither did the Ho'oden. It was 2 high school kids came and burned it to the ground. It was not clear this was actually a racial attack, but the fact it was completely abandoned and nobody was taking care of it, I think, is a sign of the prejudice of the times. Nobody could pick up the pieces because the Army took over the north end of Jackson Park to create a Nike missile base. There were huge radar towers on Promontory Point and missiles where Bobolink Meadow and the driving range are now. And the whole place went wild. Migratory birds liked it, but there weren't people hanging around in the park much. The Army left in the late 60s, and so there's this long effort to reclaim Wooded Island. Jackson Park Advisory Council is formed, and HPKCC has annual festivals. to try to reclaim it. But there's one person in particular who's passionate about trying to restore the Japanese garden, and that's George Cooley. He's an urban planner and very active around Hyde Park in lots of capacities. And he fought hard all the way through the 70s to try to find the financing to put it back together. And he finally gets $400,000 in federal grants. And so the garden is restored in 1981. The open pavilion is built then, the one that we still have. There's a moon bridge and paths and a little waterfall. And he and the designer are both awarded the Frederick Law Olmsted Award for putting it back in the park. Unfortunately, it was neglected. 2 months after it was dedicated, there's already letters in the Herald complaining that the grass isn't mowed, the trees are dying, there's beer cans floating in the lily pads, they're really upset. And then in the mid 80s, it's really trashed. They think it was actually auto workers protesting Japanese imports. It took a lot of labor. There were a bunch of guys went in and they smashed the stone lanterns. They tore the moon bridge apart with crowbars and threw them all in the big lagoon. So it was not in great shape when Osaka came along. Osaka is Chicago's sister city. And so in 1993, they restored the garden again. They redesigned it somewhat with their own park expert. And they donated the big gate that we have now, and which is pretty magnificent. And it's that period when Bob Carr gets involved in organizing annual festivals. And that's when I got involved because I volunteered at one of the festivals and got his material. I little knew that that was where they came from. So again, it's not particularly taken care of. There aren't a lot of people who were on Wooded Island. It has a reputation of being kind of dangerous. So it's little visited and starts to fall apart. And by 2002, it's time for yet another major rehab. It's also caused because now, and it's still something we're dealing with now, is the lake water keeps fluctuating. It goes up and down and destroys the edges of everything. So they added a whole bunch of infrastructure. They changed the waterfall so it wasn't a trickle. It's now, really pumping, enough volume of water to really make some noise. And Karen Zika becomes the manager for the park district. And I have such respect for her because through a long stretch when she felt like nobody particularly was noticing what she was doing, she's kept the garden going ever since 2002. It gets a little vandalized, it gets a little graffitied, but compared to the horrible periods in the 80s and 90s, she's just doing a fantastic job. So Bob Carr went deep into the archives to research the garden, and he discovered these references to, so he got the idea that some things actually had survived. So one of the things that survived, or four of the things that survived, were the Renma panels from the Tokugawa room, the elaborate room. And they were carved, he found they were carved by a very renowned artist. So they're worthy of the Art Institute. They found millions of dollars to restore them. And so if you go to the Art Institute, you can see this bit of the Hoden up high. And you can see there's always two phoenixes, which I find interesting. Julia Bacharach, who is the park historian, got called into the bowels of a park district storage space by some workmen who said, "What's this thing?" And she realized that actually there are three more survivors. There's these three sliding doors that have survived, although they're not on display. So I don't know what the condition is at the moment, but at least they survived. So in this process of organizing things and research, Bob Carr got a connection to Yoko Ono and happened to explain this area that made him so interested and passionate. And so she was looking for places to anchor peace around the world. It's her project, of course, coming out of John Lennon's anchor peace. Most of her installations are kind of temporary, on purpose, but she wanted a permanent one. And she thought this was perfect. Yoko Ono herself experienced the problems of World War II. She had been a little girl in America. Her parents realized what was happening and took her back to Japan. So she experienced the firebombing of Tokyo, the extreme hunger. And she remembers laying on hillsides, looking at the sky and thinking that's a thing that unites us. So she calls the lotus, where that's healing the spot where the Hoden burned, sky landing, because it's this sense of the sky unifying things, but also, of course, the phoenix coming from the sky to bring hope and a new era. And I've grown to really love the lotus because it looks so different in all the different lights and at different times. And people really love interacting with it. The lotus is the center building, and the yin yang berms are the two wings. And we know it's exactly in the spot where the Hoden was because the concrete base of the Hoden came up. So if you need a seat when you're off visiting the garden, you can always take a little rest on a bit of the Columbian Exposition. And then 2018, I think this is going to be an important landmark, maybe. There's a whole team of experts, one from each prefecture in Japan, came to the garden and adjusted the stones for the waterfall, and they turned it into a not just a single cascade, but a multiple cascade, and increased the sound. They were tuning the oral space. They were tuning the kind of sound that they get from the waterfall. But they also drew up a plan of how to expand the garden if funds and the will ever appear, with the presidential center coming and the fact that huge crowds are coming to the garden now. It may be very useful to have an expert plan in the future. And the reason that we're getting crowds are the cherry trees. So for the 120th anniversary, apparently Japan views anniversaries in 60-year increments. So 120 was a big anniversary. The Japanese donated the 120 cherry trees. And then there were some other anniversaries that devoted, get more, and the park district has just planted a bunch. So I bet there's 300 to 400 trees now. The trouble is they planted little trees, so they really haven't done their thing until just lately. And in 2021, we had this freakishly warm weather, and every cherry tree bloomed at exactly the same time. And it was quite spectacular. And somebody put it on TikTok. And people found it on TikTok and came flooding to Jackson Park by the literal thousands. We were trying to do a head count at one point of who was coming to the Japanese garden. It was kind of intimidating. So in 2022, the Japanese Cultural Center staged an actual Hanami festival. And the reason cherry trees are, well, a lot of people who are coming are simply, it's beautiful and it's fun. But the Japanese refound the garden because of the cherry trees, because Hanami is so important in Japan. It's a festival that dates from the 11th century and the same time as the Temple of the Phoenix. And the reason it's important in an agricultural society is the cherry trees blooming signaled that the weather was right to plant the rice. So it was this major moment in the agricultural year. So as a result, the Japanese are once more involved in the garden and thinking about it. So we had a little impromptu Children's Day in 2021, and the Council General came and demonstrated playing with what you should do at Children's Day. They had a virtual bone dance festival last year, and I think it might be having an in-person one. They had moon viewing festival last fall, and this spring they had an official Hanami festival where they demonstrated the dancing and the drumming and origami. That was a huge crowd. So now we're going to get to tour the garden. As it was 2 weeks ago, as you probably know, there has been the bridge was already falling apart. It's not clear that arson damaged the bridge or that they just simply decided the bridge had gotten too dangerous, but the bridge is being dismantled, and somebody torched a couple of the the landscaping around the bridge. So it does look different, but I'm going to concentrate on the tour on when it looked much better. So this is a map. The path through the garden is basically a circle with a little loop added later. This is a map that Bob Carr drew in the 1990s, actually. And we use it in the handout that we give people to help them understand the garden a bit. So we're going to follow this clockwise route through the garden. And the first step, of course, is passing through the gate that Osaka gave us. You pass through the gates. They like to have a gate for a stroll garden or a meditation garden, because they want to mark that transition from the mundane to the spiritual experience. And they want you to pause and shake the dust of the world off before you go in and find a greater sense of peace. And then you encounter the path. And other Western gardens are, of course, more freeform and you move through them. In the stroll garden, the paths are thought out so that your view is screened sometimes, it opens up sometimes. Every vista is a little different. And so following the path, shapes your experience. In a Japanese garden, there are lanterns. Some of them are strictly on the path. And there are lanterns because they are symbolically the light of Buddha's teachings. And so they're illuminating the path and they're illuminating the darkness of the world as you move through the garden. A lot of gardens have some kind of structure that's zigzag, and I really like our zigzag rocks. They force you to slow down and pay attention. They're a little rocky, sometimes a little slippery. There's water in between them. And it's a deliberate attempt to make you slow down and not motor through the garden as fast as you can, but take it easy, look around, pay attention. There's also a myth that demons travel only in straight lines. So there is a story you encounter when reading about Japanese gardens, that the zigzag structures are designed to you zig, and whatever demons are following you into the garden fall into the water. And I like that metaphor that whatever bad energy you've brought with you, that you let it go and experience the garden. The stones are the main structure in the Japanese stroll garden, or there's some other Japanese style gardens too. They are the bones of the earth. They are the thing that's chosen first, not the plants, the stones. And they are chosen for their weathering, their veins, the color, the lichens. So they're chosen for their aesthetics, but they're there to communicate endurance and being grounded. The moon bridge. So sad, but they're called moon bridges because you're viewing the moon. It's for moon viewing. It's not because of the shape. But they are designed to reflect into calm water and form a shape. So ours is kind of an oblong. There are a lot of them that form true circles. And that's because the moon bridge is a form of completion. And they're difficult to cross because completion is difficult to achieve. So it's warning us to be determined and to be patient in seeking to better ourselves. I also chose this photo because it shows that there are these metal fences around a lot of the trees. This is not a standard feature of Japanese gardens. That's a standard feature of our gardens because we have beavers. They showed up in 1987, and the first clue they had was that 15 large Japanese crabapples went down in one night. And they're back in 2020. I found these stumps out on Wooded Island, and you can see all the chips around it. They really goat it down. So that's why everybody has a metal case, including the cherry trees. Everybody has a metal case around them. These are features of a Japanese garden. One is really standard, the sense that a borrowed landscape feature. And in this case, it's the music court bridge in the larger lagoon. The view from the path opens up and it really extends your horizon. And part of the idea of a borrowed landscape in all of the gardens is that it makes sure that the garden is connected to its environment. It's not an isolated thing, but is part of its environment. And I really like this view of the music court bridge. It's really lovely. A thing that the stroll garden does is it suggests features of nature. And this suggestion is that it's the coast. And this is like a little dock. And this is like a lighthouse. And so if you pause and meditate on it, you can think about voyaging out or coming home guided by the light. And it opens up, at the very least, it's an open flat plane there and opens up your experience. All of the trees in the Japanese garden are shaped. Nothing is just growing. They take an incredible amount of labor. So all the conifers, they produce candles, what they call them candles, is the seed things in the spring. And they have to be taken off by hand. There's just, Japanese gardens are expensive. And this one is, you can see it's opened up, forced to be, forced to be horizontal. And the bark is rubbed. It's a red spruce to bring out the redness of the bark. The bushes are all shaped. Most of them are mounds. Some of them are just mounds because that's a lovely form. But this structure occurs in Japanese gardens, and it's to evoke the sense of rolling foothills going up to the mountains. So the Weeping Beach is like the mountains. So it's again suggesting the variety of landscape. And this is kind of underwater in this picture, but I like the mallard. So you quite often see, every Japanese garden I've been in has the island of the immortals, an island in the pond that you can't go to. And apparently there's an actual island that's in the north part of Japan where the currents and the winds are such that you just can't sail to it. And so they decided it was where the immortals live in perfect happiness. Immortals can't go there because we can't achieve perfect happiness. They're in the garden to remind us to not complain or focus on the ways we're not happy, because we're never going to be perfectly happy, but instead to find what calm and peace we can. And then the waterfall that the guys really repaired or fixed in 2018. It's much bigger. It's got these multiple cascades. It's really quite dramatic now. It's really lovely. And they've tuned the sound so it's much louder. It screens the traffic noise from Lakeshore Drive, which is fantastic. Waterfalls are in the gardens because they remind us of the cycle of life, that water rises to the heavens, falls again, rises again, and it's cycling through. It also aerates the pond. It moves the water in the pond. So the pond's much healthier when the waterfall is on. It creates the sound that screens other noise and creates this oral space for the garden. But it also, as it turns out, water dropping like that ionizes the air. So it literally makes you happier to be by the waterfall. And I've noticed the great blue heron loves to stand near it. So maybe the heron is sensing some of the ionized air. So I made a tiny little video to give you just a little sense of how it flows now and the sound it makes. And one of my favorite parts of the the garden right now are our koi. There's about 17 koi that have lived now there a number of years. They're getting really big. They winter over. It's 25 feet deep with a mud bottom. So they just go down and kind of semi-hibernate through the winter. There's a whole discussion I found about koi that says they're in Japanese gardens in order to think about how to calm our busy thoughts. I'll have to say that if you feed the koi, they are not calm. They all come flooding over and fight each other for the food. So I'm not sure who decided koi might communicate a calm feeling, but I like them. So I'm continuing to walk around the pond. There's from a very early version, I think the 90s version of the garden is this purification vessel, and the bamboo fountain that fills it. It's was up by the pavilion, kind of symbolizing if it had been a tea house, you would do real or symbolic purification at this, but it's a lovely feature now. And here's the pavilion, dates from the 1980s. And here are the steps from the 1935 edition of the garden. It's not a tea house, but it is used. You can bump into all kinds of people here on Buddhist meditation, yoga classes, picnics. I mean, all kinds of uses made of the pavilion. So it's maybe, it's a useful thing. And of course, the cultural center is using it for various of their programs. And I chose this partly because it showed the steps, but also to mention the plantings. The plantings are, most of the plantings are not traditional Japanese plants. They're plants that survive in Chicago. And these are, in fact, native plants, Virginia bluebells and redbud tree. One of the thoughts about plants in a garden, in the Japanese garden, is what the plants do. The stones speak of endurance. The plants speak of unification, because plants rooted in the earth, they need water and air, and they need the fire of the sun. So they unify the elements, and so should we, is the message. So there are 2 Kasuga lanterns in the garden. This one is by the pavilion and is one of, I'm not even sure which one, probably the 1990s iteration. This is from the 1935 era. Kasuga is a Shinto shrine, and these lanterns, so the deer that surround the Kasuga Shinto shrine are seen as spiritual messengers. And the lanterns, you can tell it's a Kasuga lantern because it has a deer on the outside. It has a stag usually on the other side, and the sun and the moon. And they also, unify the elements. The base is broad and grounded on the earth. The stem rises it up into the air. The firebox, of course, is fire, where you put the light. And then this is symbolically water and a lotus bud. So the Kasuga lanterns are really a beautiful addition. And I like this one, and so does the great blue heron. You can quite often find him hanging out next to the Renkai lantern, which is designed to overarch the water from the land. And the roof is particularly broad because it's meant to catch snow. And then the last environment we go through on our way back to the gate is the forest, a suggestion of the forest. The trees are very close to the path that's dense shade, and you have this mossy shade-loving plant area that is really lovely. So the garden always changes. Every time I go, people who connect with me on Facebook realize I post pictures all the time, because every time I go, there's something that's changed. And that's what the flowers and the colored leaves in autumn are for, is to remind us of the past, of how time passes. So there's this carpet of snowdrops in February. This is more like March when the forsythia and the weeping cherry come out. And then there's an explosion of color, maybe a little too much color for traditional Japanese gardens, but there's this explosion of color in May, right after when the cherry trees are out. And that's the surging energy of spring. You know, the sun is back, the light is back, and we are experiencing that exuberance of, you know, launching into a new year. As we head towards summer, there are fewer, they more are tiny spots of color that pull your eye over to particular parts. There's an ever increasing number of Japanese iris being planted because they can have wet feet and they can have dry feet. So with the fluctuating lake levels, there's going to be in a year or two, just a magnificent bloom of the Japanese iris. And then deep in the summer, it's about vitality, growth, you know, working at the culmination of all of our earlier efforts to plant our crops. And the garden becomes very green, but they've concentrated a lot on supplying many, many different textures of green. So it's still extremely interesting. And of course, there's always the rocks. And it's late in the summer that the water lilies bloom, which are lovely. Autumn, there's a bunch of trees and bushes that have been chosen particularly for their autumn color in the garden. It's also when the migratory birds are going through. So you get a lot of birders and you get a lot of birds moving through. Of course, it's the harvest and it's the last gasp of warmth, and it's that retreat of energy back down into the roots. There are a lot of Zen koans that are written about autumn. It's important in Japanese thinking. Oops, I'm going backwards. And of course, winter. A lot of things are chosen for their winter appearance. Lately, we haven't had a lot of snow, but there are stems of trees that are colored, they're evergreens, and you know, it's really lovely. I had to laugh at myself though when I took this picture. I realized there was a heavy snow, and so I thought, it's early in the morning and I will run out, it's still snowing, and I will run out to the Japanese garden and I'll be able to take pictures where there are no footprints. And I was probably the 5th person to be there. There were footprints all over the place. So people come and appreciate it even in winter. And finally, I wanted to pay a little tribute to what I view as sort of the guardian spirits of the garden, which are the water birds that hang around most of the year. So there's always these resident mallards. That's a green heron, a black-capped night heron. The cormorants they aren't in the garden, but they hang out around the music court bridge, so you see them. And of course, the egret is stunning when it's in flight, but the great blue heron lives there all the time. You almost always encounter him. He's there to greet you. And so that's my tour of the Japanese garden. And I can stop sharing the screen. There. And answer any questions.
Well, to get us started, there's 2 questions that came through. One is it now safe to go on into the garden yourself? And then secondly, is there any group that is now sponsoring guided tours, and who might they be?
So I go by myself all the time, and these days there's almost always somebody else there. So it's been found. So I think it's totally safe. I've never had any encounter that made me uncomfortable. So I would not feel, particularly these days. And then on the weekends, it's kind of crowded. So it's actually maybe too many people. So that's, that's not, that's a kind of trade-off. But yeah, I think it's really changed. And I mean, there's so many people. I mean, even the, Bobolink Meadow and Wooded Island, the further out into the natural areas, I've never encountered a problem, and I'm walking through there all the time. The so the guided tours, no, I kind of thought about it for a while, but you need an organization, you need somebody setting it up. The Chicago Architecture Center seems to show up periodically. I don't think they're just touring the Japanese garden. I don't know if it's an 1893 World's Fair tour. I don't know what it is, but they will show up. They don't talk about the garden. They kind of motor through really fast. But on the weekends, Saturday and Sunday afternoon, the Jackson Park Advisory Council tries to have docents, I guess you call them docents, who are handing out the handout and will answer questions. It's kind of winding down now, but this summer I was there from 11 to 1 on Sundays. I might try that again next year. And I'm happy to guide anybody or show anybody around and talk about the actual plants. I haven't talked about the plants because it's people complain that we don't have botanical labels, and it's like that's not the idea of a Japanese garden. It's about the energy of the garden and not the literal learning of the garden. But I have tried to research what all the plants are, or there's some I don't know, but I can identify most of them.
Does anyone else have a question they want to ask Trish? Speak up. Unmute yourself.
Well, I think I'm unmuted, Terry.
You are.
Okay. My brother and his husband come to visit us, and they are walkers, and they discovered the Japanese garden the last time they were here. And Anne is very interested in Buddhism and Zen. I didn't even know it existed. And so as soon as this video is posted on our website, I'm going to let them know. And maybe the next time they come, we can all go walking. But but I think the important thing is the history and the context and the purpose of the garden as you laid it out. I mean, we're used to looking at the beauty of the flowers and the plants, but it has a deeper and fuller meaning. And I really appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Carol has a question. Does the Jackson Park Advisory Council train the people who are there to provide information, or might you offer such training?
I kind of once I started writing these articles for the Herald, I found I was really busy. So I've kind of backed off. So I don't know exactly what they do in terms of training people. The last year, I mean, the people are still doing it from last year. Yeah, I mean, we took a walk through and I showed them things. I think the strongest element though is the handout. People have really liked it and said it helps a lot. So getting there when somebody's handing out the handout, it in itself helps,
Question. Anyone else? Oh, yes, Dorothy, you have your hand up.
Pat, I want to thank you so much for this. I have been walking the Wooded Island and the Japanese Garden and the Bobolink Meadow since the 1960s. And I remember the Wooded Island days in the 70s and all of those things. But I have never understood sufficiently the historical context and the cultural context. And I know the next time I stroll the Japanese garden, I will do it with much more mindfulness than I have in the last 50 years. So thank you so much. That's really helpful.
I would just add, just listening, it seemed, and I've not been there, it seems like it would be a spiritual experience if you allow it to do that for you.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, so part of the reason, I mean, part of the thing that happened when it got discovered by TikTok is it became also a place where people like to come and take selfies, and large groups come and take photos. So on the weekend, it's kind of busy with, you know, somewhat alternate activities. Perfectly safe, but you know, it's not so much. But I think people have really learned more about it, and if you go on the weekdays, it really does. As I said, I bumped into many more people who are clearly meditating there, or you know, doing Buddhist, you know, there was Buddhist meditation bowls, and you know, really clearly using the garden as a meditation space. So you know, I've been really happy that the energy has really grown, appreciating the garden.
Laura,
Yeah, I have a small kind of historic piece. This goes back to sometime in the 70s. I don't remember the exact times, but there was a movement to get people on the island so
Yeah.
that they would feel that it was safe. Now, Dorothy, you may remember this. I was in a group that sang madrigals, and we used to dress up and go over and sing on the wooded island during what they had, the kind of festival. And so the whole issue of safety has come and gone for many years. But this was an effort to have a safe time and space for people to be on the island.
here are some comments that have come through, Trish. So wonderful. Thanks. Thanks so much. Thanks, Trish. Enjoyed learning the symbols of the objects in the garden. What a wonderful tour. Thank you so much. Great presentation. Fabulous tour. Thanks so much. Thanks for a wonderful presentation.
Yes.
Okay,
So,
so about visiting, actually, thought came and went and came back again. So a problem now, as probably everybody remembers, is access to the Japanese garden. So it's a little tricky to get there. The Darrow Bridge is still out. So if you park in the music court, you either have to go all the way up Bobolink Meadow and back down, or cut along the backside of the Museum of Science and Industry and around the Columbian Basin. Or you can park on Hayes Drive, but they're doing all that construction on Hayes Drive. And so access to that parking lot might be not always be available. But that gives you access to concrete paths. So it's a much more accessible access to the garden. But access is a problem. And they promise that they're going to fix the Darrow Bridge. Apparently they're doing 106 historical review. But the money apparently is available to fix it, but I have no idea when they're actually going to fix it. And I have no idea when they're going to open the bathroom, which they fixed in the music court. It's apparently fixed, but it's not open, which is really annoying.
well, here's an interesting question that just came through. Who does maintenance, such as you mentioned on the conifers? The Park District? Question mark.
Yeah, so for a while they tried to rely on volunteers, but that was, you have to be really trained, it's technical. And of course, volunteers kind of age out and, became a problem. And lately, well, Karen Ziga does a lot herself, but they actually hire a crew. So if you go on Monday, particularly Monday morning, you will encounter a crew. They're a contractor who they really know their stuff, and they're the ones that really do the hard work in the garden, moving plants, doing the decandling, removing the trying to fix the moon bridge. Yeah, they're really nice. I really like them when I've bumped into them. So Park District is finally investing in real maintenance, partly because of the numbers. You know, they respond to the fact people are there, and hopefully that will lead to even better attention to some of what's not right in the park.
Here's a last question, which goes along with the maintenance of the park and getting around. Is there any access for people with disabilities and no wheelchair, individuals who can't walk more than a block?
Yeah, it's a real issue. No, right now I would say, basically, no, it's the Hayes parking lot is 63rd. The garden is probably 60th. I mean, it's up on the other end of Wooded Island, 59th, maybe 59th. So it's a distance from Hayes, and it won't be bad once the Darrow Bridge is fixed to come from the music court, because you can park quite close to the end of the Darrow Bridge and then cut across the Darrow Bridge and you'd be almost right there. But yeah, access is a real problem.
So thank you so much, Trish, for this enlightenment and
thank you.
our tour and our map and all the highlights of the Japanese tea garden. So
wonderful.
enjoyable today and great conversations.
Let's give her a round of applause. This was so unmute. It was just so wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much.